Fellas, it was announced a few days ago that UFC 301 is going to be headlined by Pantoja and Steve Erceg, and pretty much the official card has been announced already, and it is a horrible pay-per-view. I'm not expecting some 5 out of 5, absolute world-class pay-per-view, because we are coming off $299 and $300, so I did expect a little bit of a drop-off in quality, but this card is terrible. It is if you take away the belt, it's a fight night main event, it's a fight night card at best, and I just think this card needs some serious improvements. Now, I know there's been a big fight announced, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but overall, I don't know what the UFC were doing by stacking so many Brazilian fighters from 298 all the way to 300, and then having a Brazilian pay-per-view at 301. I was fully expecting Pereira to be on a Brazilian pay-per-view, so I don't know what the UFC were thinking, but the card, it's kind of bad. It's a terrible pay-per-view, so I made to save the card and add a few fights that I think could be improved. So obviously, we got the big announcement yesterday, actually, that Jose Aldo is going to be taking on Jonathan Martinez at UFC 301. Now, this is a big fight, and it's a big co-main event. We're getting the return of one of the greatest of all time, arguably the greatest featherweight of all time in Jose Aldo. And to be completely honest, I'm glad that he's returning. I'm glad that he's returning, because I feel like the Merab fight, it should have never been his retirement fight. It was a boring fight against Merab. Not saying Merab's a horrible fighter, but it was just so boring. He was just getting held up against the cage for 3 rounds straight. It was a terrible retirement. It was a horrible fight to retire on. So I'm glad that he's back in Brazil for another retirement. Hopefully this time, if he does retire against Jonathan Martinez, it doesn't go as bad as Glover Teixeira's retirement last time we had a Brazilian retirement. So hopefully it's a good retirement and a good send-off. And to be honest, I don't mind Jonathan Martinez on the card. It's going to be a battle of leg kicks. Jonathan Martinez has literally just finished Adrian Yanez with leg kicks, and obviously we all know Jose Aldo for having some of the best kicks in the UFC. So it's going to be a battle of the leg kicks, but I have got a better matchup. Like I said, I'm not a massive hater of the fight with Jonathan Martinez, and I think it's winnable for both of them, to be completely honest. But I think Aldo versus Dominic Cruz would have been such a good send-off. It's one of those fights that I'm surprised it's never happened. I'm so surprised that we've never seen Jose Aldo versus Dominic Cruz before. It's like a legend versus a legend nowadays. Dominic Cruz, he's been out for ages. His last fight was against Marlon Vera, where he got knocked out in 2022. And obviously Aldo's also been out for a while since his Merab loss. They've both been out for a while, put it that way. They both have a bit of a layoff. It's not like one fighter has been more active than the other significantly. So I think Aldo versus Cruz, it's winnable for both of them as well. They've both had pretty good fights in the bantamweight division, and when I say recently, obviously I'm not talking about like the past year or two. I'm talking about recently in their careers. But it's not like neither of them have had a huge drop off, a massive downfall. They've both been getting wins here and there and staying pretty consistent in the division before they had layoffs. So I think Aldo versus Dominic Cruz, it'd be a big legend versus legend fight, and it's kind of a fight in the making that we all want to see. Co-main event of UFC 301. Some people would argue that it's the people's main event, to be completely honest. Aldo versus Cruz, I think that'd be a great co-main event for this card. But again, I'm not going to complain. I still think Martinez is a big fight for Aldo, and maybe Dominic Cruz turned down the fight, which is why they couldn't get it made. So I'm not going to blame the UFC, but I've still got another fight I need to add to this card, and this is going to be a featured fight. Like I said, the UFC have used all their Brazilian fighters up. There's very limited Brazilian fighters we could choose, but one fighter I think we can go with is Paulo Costa. Now, UFC 301, it's going to be in May, I believe it is, and Paulo Costa fought in February. I know he took some damage in the fight with Robert Whittaker, but I still think he can make a comeback and save UFC 301, and I think he should be against Imavov. I matched him against Imavov at the end of the UFC 298, where I matched him against a fighter, and I think him versus Imavov is a great fight for him. I think, first of all, it's a fun fight. We've got Imavov, and overall, I think it's a stylistically really good fight. Costa's not really looked, he's not really been the most consistent fighter recently, obviously. Ever since losing to Adesanya, he then missed weight and lost to Marvin Vettori. He got a win over an old, retiring Luke Rockhold, and then he goes out there and obviously just recently loses to Robert Whittaker. But he did look good against Whittaker, which is why I'm matching him up against Imavov. Imavov's coming off an impressive win over Roman Dolidze, and he also had a fairly, and I won't say close, but he didn't have a terrible fight against Sean Strickland, who's a former champion. So it's a step up for Imavov, and it's probably one of the easiest, I don't want to say easiest, but it's a drop down in competition for Paulo Costa. So I think for both of them, it's a fun fight. Sticking on the featured fight of UFC 301, Costa gets to fight in his home country, and I think it's going to be a banger of a fight. I think stylistically it'd be fun. They both want to win badly. Costa wants to get back in there, and he wants to stay active, and I think he needs to be active, considering it seems Costa's one of the most inactive fighters in the UFC. So if Costa can go from 298 to 301 and fight just 3 pay-per-views after. That's good for Paulo Costa. So that's the featured fight of the night, Paulo Costa versus Imavov. It's not yet been made, but I hope they make a fight similar to this. Or to be honest, I just want Paulo Costa on the card. I think he'd make a great addition to the card. And then the next fight, Edson Barbosa versus Josh Emmett. Now, I know that I literally just matched up Josh Emmett with Arnold Allen for my UFC London card, but that's, or Manchester card, whatever it was, but that's going to be all the way in summer, right? We can wait for that. I think there's a bit of urgency for UFC 301. Let's take Josh Emmett and let's put him against Edson Barbosa. This would be such a good fight. Edson Barbosa's looked really good in his last few. He's a legend in the featherweight division, and he's looked really good in his last few as Edson Barbosa, coming off a knockout over Billy Q and then having a great win in a Fight Night main event against Sadiq Youssef. Edson Barbosa needs to step up in competition, and I think him versus Josh Emmett, it would be such a good matchup. You've got the punishing kickboxing of Edson Barbosa, one of the best kickboxers in the UFC. His kicks are insane. And then we've got the scary power and the brawler of Josh Emmett. It's guaranteed to end in either a knockout, a brutal finish, or it's going to be an absolute war. And I feel like it's a great addition to the UFC 301 card. So Edson Barbosa versus Josh Emmett, a fight that I hope happens. I know a lot of people have also been calling for this matchup, so that's another fight that I think should be added to this card. But overall thoughts on the card, I think UFC 301, like I said at the beginning, I'm not sure why they've used all their fighters up. They've used Charles Oliveira, they've used Gilbert Burns, they've used Alex Pereira, and I've heard a few people thinking that Alex Pereira is going to be able to make a quick comeback. He's not. He's fighting Jamal Hill. It's not an easy opponent. He's going to take damage in that fight, and this is assuming that he wins. He's not going to go out there and finish Jamal Hill quickly. It's going to be an absolute war. He's definitely not going to be able to make a turnaround for the next pay-per-view. So like I said, I'm not sure why they've decided to use all their Brazilian fighters up before UFC 301, and I feel like it would have been the smarter move to, you know, save a Brazilian card later on in the year rather than already. They also used Gelton Almeida, who's just been finished by Curtis Blade, so it wasn't the smartest. But overall, the card's not terrible. We've got Paul Craig on the card as well. He's making a comeback. We've got Smith versus Petrino, which I think it's a big step. Well, it's not a big step up in competition for Petrino. He's undefeated and he's looked great in his last fight on I think it was the Giziev card as well. And then Anthony Smith needs another fight, so that's a decent fight on the card as well. We've got Mikel Pereira back, coming off a really, really good finish on UFC 299. That's a quick turnaround for him as well, literally 2 pay-per-views after. You could tell they were struggling to get Brazilian fighters on this card. But overall, Pantoja versus Erceg as well. I haven't talked about that fight yet. I think I'm kind of glad that there's fresh blood in the flyweight division for Pantoja. I'm glad that there's a new opponent and it's not just the recycled fighters getting a rematch. But really, ranked 10th Steve Erceg, I would have taken Amir Albazi over that. I would have taken Mohamed Makayev over that. Obviously, I'd rather have Erceg than Royval, considering Royval's just lost. I'm not going to complain too much. It's fresh competition, and Erceg is coming off a knockout win, so, you know, I'm not the biggest hater of that matchup. But overall, UFC 301, I think you had the couple of fights that I've just made there. And obviously, they're not going to do Aldo versus Cruz, but you had the Paulo Costa fight, you had the Edson Barbosa fight, and I think overall, you've got yourself a pretty good UFC 301 card, especially for the fact that we've just had 3 massive pay-per-views, especially 299 and 300, so it's not going to be a massive drop in quality. But yeah, that's my thoughts on 301. I think it needs a bit of work done to it, because if this is the final card, although there's a lot of hype of Jose Aldo coming back, I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. That's my thoughts on UFC 301. Let me know your thoughts on it. Thank you for watching.